So we have the seat brackets in finally. Today's project is to clean up the van some, get the insulation all back in, the flooring all back in, and then start cutting out the holes for the seat brackets to stick up through the wood in the subfloor so we can lay the vinyl over it. That way only a little bit of the floor will have a hole in it for the seats to actually click into. So we won't have a tripping hazard and a huge track with stuff getting stuck into it. So let's get started. So I have the polyiso back in. I've taped all the seams with aluminum tape so it'll kind of stay together and hopefully not move too much or squeak. So I'm going to get the plywood back in and then start working on cutting out the brackets. So I got all the foam back in, and you can see I kind of cut it around the brackets. It's not perfect. I actually cut it so that it's not necessarily pushing on this so that if it moves it doesn't squeak. This should be pretty much pressed down at all times once I get the wood in, and then put all the bolts back in the subfloor to pull it down. But just in case. Once I cut these out, and I'll kind of show you when I do that, I'll come back in and fill these rails with spray foam insulation. So only the openings where the seat brackets actually click into the seats and the pedestal will be not filled in. That way there's a little bit more insulation in the floor. Trying to get this plywood in with the doors not all the way out is kind of a pain in the butt. So that sucked. Hopefully I never have to take this wood back out again. I'm definitely gonna have to take out the first one just to cut it, but let's get started. All right, so from the wall to the bracket is 19.5 inches on center for both sections I need to cut. And then it's 26 inches up from the edge here and 14.25 up from the edge. So I can put the board back in place and then translate those markings. And I'll drill a center hole and make sure that I can see the bracket underneath. And then I'll kind of loosely trace out where I'm going to cut and tackle it with a jigsaw. So I just marked through the hole onto the bracket that goes across that you clip into. So when I take this off, I can see where that hole is centered, so I can make my cutout a little bit more precise. So I took some measurements of the feet on the seat. The back feet, about 4.5 inches long, 2.5 wide, is about how much the gap needs to be. The front needs to be about 4.5 long, but only about 1.5 inches wide. And then the distances on the center on the front is 35.25, and then on the back 35.5, because the back are wider. So I'm going to use these measurements to translate to where I drill these holes and to where I know the center marks from where I marked it onto the actual rails are, and try to cut these somewhat precise. should be right. Next, would assume the height. So I know that the dot on this was a little bit on the inside, so the center is actually here. And this needs to be 4.5 inches long. So that's 2.25. Actually, I need to move it there. Well, actually, before I do that, I need to take another measurement on the seat bracket. Because it's really not about centering this completely. It's actually where the crossbar that I'm trying to center is. So even though this is about a 4.5 clearance space, the center is actually not at 2.25. So it looks to be 2 3/4 is really where this bar clicks in. So we'll use that as a center point. So 2 3/4. And then the 4.5 length. So correct, this will give us our slot for the seat. And then I'll still need to notch the crossbar rail because it'll actually need to come into the wood off to the side, so this will sit all the way down. I'm going to cut the squares out first, get it in position, make sure that looks right, and then accurately try to mark where those crossbars are so that this can sit in just one step at a time. So I got the subfloor back in, and as you can see, channels are pretty well aligned. So like this edge is flush with the inside, which is exactly what I want. And the backs are a little wider. Once I put the bench in, I'll show why. So I'm gonna mark out where these rails go across so that I can notch these blocks out. And then once I get a second set of hands, I'll actually put the bench back in and make sure the fitment's good and see if I need to make these cutouts any bigger. So I realized well after the fact I didn't film anything regarding putting the notches in and finalizing the subfloor, so I wanted to kind of jump into the future here and show you how that ended up. So you'll see that I notched the plywood around the cross supports, and this is actually where the seat hooks in. And when I bought these seat rails, I took measurements of them, knowing if they sat flush on the body of the floor of the van, how much height I would need to build the floor to or allow for it to sit flush, so that eventually the vinyl flooring could sit in place and sit flush. And it worked out pretty well. So there's 1.5 inches of foam insulation of the floor. This is essentially a 1/2 inch piece of ply, and it works out where it's completely below the subfloor then. And when the seats click in, it fits really, really snug and really good. And you'll notice the notch for these, with more of it on the back side, worked out well as well, so that the seats can click in. So we're pretty happy with the way it turned out. The seats go in and out really smoothly. The only downside is the seats weigh like a ton, so it really does require 2 people working together to get the seats in and out. But I'll catch you on the next episode.